Welcome back to this, the 10th episode of Blue Collar, White Collar, with me, your host, Kieran, and my co-host, Nicholas Wheeler-Hughes. How you doing, Nick?
I am good. We have hit double digits. Our viewership is rising exponentially, and it's very exciting. And, it's a very exciting time in Canadian politics. We just had our federal election recently, and this is going to be our federal election episode where we're going to discuss the results and where we see each of the parties going from here. So looking forward to the discussion.
Yes, and in this episode, once again, Kieran is incapable of predicting political outcomes. In other words, wet. So unlike what I was expecting, I had said that we would probably still end up with a Conservative win, but due to the influence of our neighbours down south, we ended up with a fourth term of the Liberal government led by Mark Carney. What do you think about that? Are you happy? Are you sad? Do you wish that your party would have done better?
My party, like the NDP?
Yes, we
will talk about the NDP. Look, there were two candidates for Prime Minister in this race, Carney and Poilievre. I think Carney is the much better choice between the two, and I'm happy he won. I actually, I'm not sure whether I would rather him have a majority or not. It's super close to a majority. I'm not sure if you saw this, but Terrebonne, which is a riding in Quebec, was just called for the Liberals after kind of going back and forth, and it was called after the single vote decided it. Did you see that?
No. That's very close.
One vote.
They probably had to recount that several times.
They've recounted several times, and they called it back and forth. Anyway, so all to say that the Liberals are now at a clean 170, so 2 away. Or, what I'd like to think of is 1 away from Elizabeth May holding the balance of power.
Is she the only Green party?
And she's the only Green. It was just one. There were 2 before, but I lost.
And one of only 3 party leaders to win their riding, which is quite embarrassing.
That's true. That's funny. I never even thought of it that way. But yeah, party leaders were getting smoked. Anyway, so look, I definitely prefer Carney over Poilievre. I think, Carney met the moment of Trump in a way that Poilievre failed to. I think Carney's resume, his background, is also better suited to deal with Trump. And I think that based on the interactions they had at the White House, which we will get into a little bit later, that seemed to go as well as it could have. And therefore, it bodes well for the relationship moving forward. Like, I'm not as afraid of this prospect of a U.S. invasion as I was 6 months ago, or even 3 months ago, I guess. Time flies when Trump is president. So, yeah,
Well, 6 months ago, this wouldn't have been a conversation.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy. I was very worried about the Poilievre government, as we've talked about, and I'm happy it's not happening. I think he's weakened by the fact that he lost his own riding, and then he had to, for Carney's permission, to start his by-election right away, because Carney could have delayed that by months and months. And Carney said, no, Pierre, you go for it. Go ahead.
And
so,
that is a signal of strength. That is a signal of strength, him saying that, you go ahead and do that. I'm not worried about what's going on with you. So
imagine he lost that. Imagine he lost that by-election as well.
He might.
He's in the safest riding in Canada.
Anyway,
What about you, Kieran? How did you feel about the results?
I, of course, was kind of disappointed. I was hoping to see the Conservatives finally take over. I've been not only deeply disappointed with the way that the Liberals, or the illiberals, as I like to refer to them as, have ran Canada for the last 10 years, that I was hoping that they would have been trounced. And unfortunately, they didn't. They came back for a resounding victory. They ended up gaining more seats than they had in the last election, and I think maybe even more than the one before that, but it was close.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. This is this is the closest they've been to a majority since
2015.
the 2015 election.
As per how Mark Carney has done so far, I think he's done pretty well. His meeting with Trump, clearly, he knows how to flatter him in ways to get what he wants out of him while also maintaining a strong position. So he's done better than I could have expected. Well, maybe not than I could have expected, but
I suggest we save like Prime Minister Mark Carney, like what that actually looks like, until after we've just talked about like the results itself.
Yeah, sure. As we said, only 3 of the party leaders ended up actually winning their riding. You had Mark Carney won his riding, which would have been hilarious if he didn't, but then still won. Made government. Elizabeth May won. I don't even know what province she's in. I'm pretty sure she's in BC.
She's in BC.
Yeah, and Yves-François Blanchet, I believe, also won in his riding. Whereas the 2 leaders of the typically second and third thought of parties, the Conservatives and the NDP, actually both lost theirs, which is quite pathetic. If you're losing as the leader, there's a reason. So Jagmeet, the leader of the NDP, has stepped down and is no longer going to be the leader of the NDP, or he will be at some point. I don't know if he's officially out, but he has said he's going to.
He's officially out because they've named an interim.
So they have named an interim, okay. And Pierre Poilievre has stayed on as the leader of the Conservative Party, which I actually don't think that is the right move. I think that if you're not an MP, I don't think you should be allowed to be a leader of the party. One of the reasons that I did not like the idea of Mark Carney being our prime minister in the first place before he won the election, I think you should have to be an MP before you're allowed to take leadership of a party. Unless you create a whole new party. That's a different...
Well, Mark Carney wasn't.
Mark
Carney didn't have a riding, right?
That was my point. I did not like when he won the leadership race because he wasn't an MP. He shouldn't have been allowed to run, in my opinion, because of that reason. But clearly, it was allowed legally, and he won the election, so it was the right decision for them. Overall, I think if you look at the numbers, I'm pretty sure it bears out that the election ended up coming down to how did older people vote. And it seems like older people voted for the Liberals en masse. If you look at the way that they cast their vote against the forces of Donald Trump more than any other age group. If you look by the way that the different age groups thought of the subject, most people under the age of 55 really didn't think that dealing with Donald Trump was that important of an issue. Of course, that's just an average. Everyone's going to be different. It's just a generalization.
Or that Pierre Poilievre was better suited, right? Because Pierre Poilievre, with young voters and particularly young men, did extremely well.
Yes, that's true.
And I think a lot of that he picked up in Ontario, because the one place that you could point to where the Conservatives really picked up seats. The Liberals actually lost seats in Ontario, and the NDP lost all their seats in Ontario. But the Conservatives were the big winners in Ontario, and a big part of that was young men voting for Poilievre. Mm-hmm. And from the analysis that I've been hearing and talking to, what that means when you have younger voters is that your party's in a healthy state, right? Because those young voters will become middle-aged and probably still support you. Did you see that commercial that the Conservatives ran with the two older golfers?
I didn't watch it, but I listened to it. I was listening to a podcast and they ran it. And it was kind of cringe, in my opinion.
It was super cringe. But the point of it was they were targeting older folks because they realized that a lot of the older folks who were not fans of Trudeau were fans of Carney. Mm-hmm. And so over to the Liberals. So I think it's impossible to quantify to who flipped necessarily, whether any individual person who was previously voted Conservative now voted Liberal or vice versa. But it does feel as though this idea that we have of Conservatives being for older folks and Liberals being for younger folks, that's kind of been flipped now, mm-hmm. right? So probably bodes well for the Conservatives in the future, but obviously that didn't matter.
Yeah, based off of the graphs that I saw, when it really was the older folks who thought that dealing with Trump was a priority, and those people, on average, voted for Mark Carney, whereas
That's right.
people who are younger voted all sorts of different ways, obviously, but they voted less for the Liberals than the 55, 65, that plus range. You in the last podcast said your grandfather was going to vote for Mark Carney, and I wasn't sure how that would play out because I work in an environment where I know there's a decent balance between people of political views, but there's not that many people who are in that age range, and the ones that are already fairly conservative people. So I didn't see that. So that's one of the reasons that I did not see that sweep coming in the way that it did. But you're right when you said your grandfather was voting that way. Lots of grandparents voted that way.
I it's only now that I'm making that connection between the personal story of my grandfather and how he represents that trend of older folks who would vote conservative, but who in this case lent their vote to the Liberals. And I think this kind of segues into my next point, and what I'd like to discuss a little bit more is like why this happened. Because I think when you look at the political landscape 6 months ago, when Trudeau is still in, and the Conservatives are ahead by over 20 points, it just felt so inevitable, right? And obviously talking about that back then. But I think, and what I've heard and what I agree with is that Pierre Poilievre failed to pivot enough, not against Mark Carney, but in the context of Trump.
That's fair.
What Doug Ford did in Ontario was he made his entire campaign about Trump. Right? He got his third majority on it, when he probably shouldn't. He was on track to either go down to a minority or, very unlikely but possible, lose. And instead what he did was he started wearing the Canada's Not For Sale baseball caps and made his entire campaign about that, and he got his third majority. And the campaign manager for Doug Ford's campaign, who is a very well-known, well-respected organizer in the Conservative Party, went public and said it was criminal what the federal Conservatives did by trying to stick to this cost of living election that they wanted so badly. The carbon tax election, the cost of living election, that's what they were going to win on against Trudeau. They were going to slaughter him, right? And then it's not that Carney came in and changed everything, it's that Trump came in and changed everything. And yes, Poilievre had a harder line to walk because some of his supporters were Trump supporters. So he couldn't come out and say, I am against Trump, we have to stand up to this guy, in the way that Carney was able to. But it kind of felt as though Trump was just one piece of Poilievre's campaign, whereas Trump was the only real piece of Carney's campaign. Carney saying, we need to build one Canadian economy, not 13. We need to be more self-reliant, less dependent on the United States. Like, that's his whole thing, right? That's his whole thing. And he won on that. He almost got a majority on it. So I think the Conservatives made a mistake in making Trump only one of several issues when it should have been the umbrella issue. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
I definitely agree with some of that. One place that I think there's a mild disagreement is when you said that Pierre Poilievre should not have stopped talking about the cost of living, but when he made a villain for who's going to be the biggest cost, who's going to be the biggest problem in terms of for Canada, he was still pointed at Trudeau and the Liberals. And if he would have addressed the cost of living while pointing the target at Trump's back at the same time, I think that would have been a much better play. You still got to address the cost of living, because if you looked at the same graph I was talking about where elderly people were the ones who thought that Trump was the biggest threat, if you looked at the cost of living and was one of the biggest issues for younger voters.
Yeah. Interesting. And that's probably your two. So your argument is that Pierre Poilievre picked up young voters because he was more focused on cost of living issues that are maybe less pertinent to older folks, as you call them, the elderly. Although I think we're talking like 50 plus.
I'm pretty sure it was 55 plus, but yeah, I guess that's not elderly.
Dude, elderly is like 80.
Maybe nowadays you call elderly, but like you could call senior citizens is 65. You could call them elderly. You could. It wouldn't be that generous.
Your dad's 65?
He turns 65 this year, yes.
He turned or turns?
His birthday's in September. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. I'm fairly private about my life, but apparently I'm willing to throw out everyone else's secrets.
Your dad is almost elderly then, by your definition.
Yeah, close enough. He voted for Mark Carney, I'm pretty sure, so...
that would make sense.
That's elderly in my books. No, and by putting the target on Trump's back, not Trudeau's back, not Mark Carney's back, I think he would have picked up more of those older voters that he failed to pick up. Now, I have a question. This is a very minor aspect, but how much do you think played into how people voted that Mark Carney is older, had gray hair, than Pierre Poilievre? So typically the way you see it is usually the person running as a conservative is older than the liberal person who is running. And usually the people who vote conservative are an older population than the people who vote liberal. Do you think that's a coincidence, or do you think there's a certain amount of people who are just don't want to see someone younger than them or who looks significantly younger than them running the country? Once you're past a certain age, it's too late. Like once you're 85, like you're not going to have a leader who's older than you. But
that's right. How do you know how old Carney is? I don't.
It was his birthday, one of our recording sessions, if you remember.
Yes, but that gives us no indication as to how old he is.
1965, so he would be 60 this year.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
He's exactly my father's age. Okay, now we're just telling people our parents' age. What's his birthday?
March 16th.
No way.
Which was the day...
He's 9 days older than my father. That's crazy.
And now everyone knows your father's birthday. What are you going to tell him his social insurance number
everyone
next?
Already did. Yeah, I think that's probably right. Like, I think Carney's age had a small part to play, but I think it's more just his experience that people were drawn to, right? The fact that he had all these roles in, governor of Bank of, Canada and then England in the time in these economic crises. That I think lent to his win. I was actually expecting Carney to win bigger. I'll be honest with you. I was predicting something like 180 seats. I thought Carney was going to sweep. So my prediction was also wrong, right? I had said something like 180. He got 170, so I was off. And again, we kind of touched on this. A big part of that was Ontario. Right? Ontario voted more for the Conservatives than for the Liberals. That's where they picked up seats. The Liberals did extremely well in Quebec. They did better than Trudeau did in either 2019 or 2021.
Which you had predicted.
With a guy who barely speaks French. Mm-hmm. Quebec is weird, man.
But as you said, because Canada is united in its Canadianness, they are less in their separatist mindset, less likely to vote for the Bloc, and ended up voting Liberal, which is exactly what you said last time.
Precisely. And that's going to have some implications at the provincial level as well.
Turns out, if you want to be correct, listen to Nick. If you want to be incorrect, listen to me.
Yeah. Well, if you want to be more correct, listen to Nick. But Nick was not spot on by any means. I had some friends who were predicting a Liberal minority, and I should have listened to them.
It was close.
What do you think? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the Conservative Party, then I want to talk about the NDP. Pierre Poilievre as leader. He lost his own riding. Why he lost his own riding is not totally clear to me. I know that the Liberal candidate was knocking on doors for 2 years nonstop. So he had an incredibly powerful ground game. And he was knocking on doors way before Carney came in and saved the party, right? This guy, I forget his name, but he was just nonstop planting these seeds. And I think Pierre Poilievre also kind of just went, I've won this, every time for the last, 20 years or something?
I think it was about 20 years he held it.
I think he was 25 when he first got elected in that riding of Carleton, Ontario. And he thought, well, I'm leader now. Like, I can't lose it. Like, I don't need to campaign. So I think it was a combination of the Liberals, A, having a guy who had a really strong ground game, and then B, the party throwing quite a lot of money and resources into it. But also Pierre Poilievre kind of taking it for granted and just assuming that he would win. I cannot imagine being Pierre Poilievre's local campaign manager, who's in charge of winning him that one riding. He must have got punched or something, that guy. Or girl, I don't know. But they are in big trouble. It's a huge embarrassment for him, right?
Absolutely.
The Conservative Party picked up seats. They actually did well overall, and you'll see you saw in Pierre's victory speech, he framed it as a victory speech. He said, look, we didn't get all the way, but we made progress, and we're on the right track, right? We're picking up seats. They picked up seats in Quebec as well. Not a ton. They picked up seats in BC. So as a whole, they're on the rise, right? I think they even picked up a few seats in the Maritimes. So generally speaking, the Conservative Party is going up. The Liberals are also going up. Everyone else is going down. So who knows? But at the same time, the fact that he kind of has to come, with his tail between his legs to this safe Alberta riding, where he'll undoubtedly win. He'll come back in and he'll continue advocating for his party and for his, his own prime ministership, which he hopes to still achieve one day. I think he stays on as leader. I don't think he goes anywhere. And I think the biggest reason for that is not because Pierre Poilievre is an extraordinary politician, it's because the Conservatives don't have anyone else.
Yeah, I agree with that. When Pierre first started doing the podcast tour, I really liked a lot of the things he had to say. He was calling out a lot of the authoritarian tendencies of Justin Trudeau, and I think he was 100% correct on that. And as he started to gain more popularity, I started to like him less, interestingly enough. Maybe that's my contrarianness. And
do you know why he did that podcast?
To pick up people like me.
To humanize him.
Well, it wasn't just a podcast. He did many podcasts over multiple years.
But his own podcast.
Oh, he's a podcast? I never listened to that.
Pierre Poilievre created a podcast with his wife to talk about issues. And they had basically they had their own podcast, but they had different people interviewing them every time, and they were talking about different subjects.
That's kind of weird.
But the point was we need to contrast Pierre to this unhuman Trump, right? That was his biggest problem, was he seemed too Trumpy, and so they were like, okay, what's the least Trump thing we can do? We'll start a podcast with his wife, basically.
Yeah, and I think that overall was probably in some ways a good idea, in some ways a bad idea. Yeah. I think it's a bad idea insofar as it just seems kind of cringe to me. I don't think politicians should have podcasts. When Ted Cruz started The Verdict. Yeah, don't even get me started there. It's just it just feels weird. People who've retired from politics and then start one, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that.
They're looking for a paycheck.
They're able to be more honest as well. And I think in what you said, to humanize him was the good side of it, because a lot of people saw him as either robotic or angry, because he was Stephen Harper's attack dog, and he viciously attacked Trudeau nonstop. I don't think any time he spoke while the two of them were in Parliament together, he didn't bring up the name Trudeau.
That's right.
And so he definitely had a love-hate man-crush relationship with him, kind of like you and I.
In which direction?
That's for them to decide.
That's for the viewer to decide.
4 downloads.
Yeah, 3 of them are you.
No, they're not. California, remember?
I'm kidding. We're on the rise.
I know. Fucking number 1 podcast next week, I'm sure.
Pretty soon we'll have as many listeners as the NDP have seats.
We'll get to them in a second. Yeah, personally, as I said, I don't like the idea of a party leader not being an MP. So if he's doing a by-election to try and steal someone else's seat, basically, Is basically what he'd be doing. Even moving to a different province completely seems kind of slimy. But you're right. The Conservatives don't have anyone else. In the last three elections, or well, last 3 elections before this one, they have switched party leader. They dropped Stephen Harper when he lost his prime ministership. Then they dropped Andrew Scheer when he lost the race. And then they dropped Aaron O'Toole when he lost the race. And Pierre was their golden boy, their silver boy. Because they didn't have a golden boy. A golden boy would have won them this election. And they don't have someone who can come take the reins from him right now. Like, you pay more attention to politics than your average person. I don't think you'd be able to tell someone, I don't think you'd be able to name me a name of anyone that could hold a candle to Pierre Poilievre, and he's not even, he couldn't even win this election. So.
I got one.
Is it Michelle Rampoule, or whatever her name is?
No.
Okay. Who do you think Doug Ford's going to take it?
Doug Ford.
Yeah, see, I think that's a terrible idea.
I think so too. Doug Ford said today that he was going to learn French.
Yeah, that is definitely a definite signal, because you basically have to be able to speak French to be the prime minister, and so that is definitely something. But I don't.
Basic level, right? Carney had a basic level, and he won.
Yeah, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think he's a particularly great politician. I think he's managed to. I think a lot of his success was off the back of people in Ontario having some disdain for Trudeau, much in the way that New Brunswick usually had an opposite party in the provincial politics to the federal party. I think he was probably riding off a similar effect in Ontario.
And it's not immediate, right? I think that Doug Ford, having just won a majority, he's going to stay in Ontario for 4 years, right? He's not going anywhere. So this is probably a longer term play. He's probably thinking, 3 majorities. I can definitely run for prime minister on that. But that's in the 2030s, right? So I agree with you. There is no one who could step up now, who could replace Pierre now. Maybe there's someone who could come out of. I don't know the Conservatives that well. I don't know who's in their shadow cabinet or whatever, like who their kind of top dogs are. But I haven't really heard any names thrown.
Yeah. So here's a question for you. Do you think that there will be an election in 2 years? So 2027, October 2027. It'll be a year and a half, but
it's tricky because the Liberals are so close to a majority, right? And there are still a couple races that are being recounted. So,
assuming the numbers that
harder.
are currently.
That's right. Majority, you get 4 years. He's so close to a majority, it's going to be hard to bring him down.
You need
right? Harder.
You need all 3 opposition parties, all three non-leading parties because
non-green parties, yeah.
Because the Conservatives and the Bloc together only make 165, so they need the 7 seat. They need the 7 from the NDP to actually take it.
The NDP are still relevant, right? The NDP are absolutely still relevant in the balance of power. They have some say, not very strong on their own, but just in the math, the NDP. But you know what? Like, there's also going to be by-elections that happen, right? Like, there are people who are going to resign or get sick or whatever.
Die.
So it's possible, and I think that every by-election, when it's this close, when the balance of power could flip to a majority off of a couple by-elections, both the Conservatives and the Liberals are going to throw everything they have at any by-election that comes, and it's very possible that in the next couple of years, the Liberals get their majority. So I don't really think there's going to be, I think they're going to get at least 2 years. I think they're going to get 2. It'll also depend on how Carney handles Trump, right?
Mm-hmm.
If Carney's doing well, with Trump, if we remain unthreatened, at least if we're kind of able to maintain this current course, which is, they seem to be somewhat willing to work together. This idea of the 51st state kind of feels like it's losing steam a little bit. Trump is calling Carney prime minister and not governor. So I think Trump's moved on to other things. Frankly, I think his child mind has switched.
Definitely.
To something.
So I think I agree with most of what
yeah.
you said. But I would hinge his election on two things. If he wants to make it to 4 years, I think he has to balance managing Canada's economy and Trump at the same time. If he fails on either of those, I think there will likely be an election in 2 years.
Yeah, look, there are a couple things that could bring him down, right? Trump re-escalating tensions. People will go, oh shit, okay, Carney's no longer the guy. Increased, like a recession is very bad, or some kind of economic crisis. I think if things continue as they are, which is not great, obviously cost of things like housing very high. Carney bringing things down, I think, is not likely, but slowing the rise of these kinds of costs is not something that's particularly sexy, particularly visible. So I think it would take things getting drastically worse for Carney to be under threat. And you need to have an argument, right? When you bring down the government, the other three parties need to unite behind an argument, which is this person is no longer fit to govern. So they need a reason. So everyone's watching Carney very closely, right? This guy fucks up, he's in danger. But if he can perform, then I think he's going to be fine. So let's see how he does. And maybe we can talk a little bit about him and Trump in a second, but I don't want to forget the NDP.
Yeah, I was actually going to use this as a moment to transfer to the NDP as well, because, as I said, they, in a way, hold the balance of that election being called, because the Bloc and the Conservatives, 9 times out of 10, will try and get rid of the
François Blanchet said he was willing to work with Carney.
Yeah.
Who is very popular in Quebec.
True.
Right? Carney's very popular in Quebec.
But if things are at a place where it's going to happen, he's going to vote with it. His party will likely try and gain more seats, saying, "Look, the Liberals failed. We need our seats back." And I think that the NDP being those 7 seats really mattering to take down Carney is an opportunity for what I think the NDP needs to do, which is actually be more oppositional towards the Liberals and get from the Liberals what they can while the Liberals are in power, but also not be so acquiescent to them in the way that Jagmeet had been under Justin Trudeau. They need to stand out and say, look, we're not just additional Liberal seats, which they basically were.
I think the NDP need to do a little kind of meditating, little self work, right? Put their own house in order. But I don't see the Bloc or the NDP going after Carney anytime soon, frankly.
Not right away. But I said in the 2 years, say 2 years comes around and Mark is doing, poorly, but not terrible.
What we've learned is that, Canadian politics can change on a dime, right?
Apparently.
So we'll have to see what happens, and predicting what happens in 2 years it's impossible now because it's so far away.
So who is this interim leader of the NDP? Because I don't actually know.
Don Davies. He's one of the 3 BC NDPers who got reelected. There were obviously no new NDP candidates who flipped seats. It was only 7 sitting MPs of the 25, I think, member caucus.
Devastating loss.
So Don Davies, I don't know too much about him, but I think he's been around. I think he's sat in his seat for at least 2 terms before now. Solid middle-aged progressive guy. But beyond that, I couldn't tell you a whole lot about him. And the fact that he's willing to sit as interim suggests that he doesn't have any leadership ambitions.
Yeah.
Why did the NDP get smoked? That's a question I've been thinking about a lot. That's probably one of the biggest questions that I've been reflecting on, because I think when you think of the NDP, you can think of the party, as in the party led by Jagmeet, with certain ideas that they were putting forward. And then I think you can also think of the NDP and where they're thought of more generally is to the left of the Liberals, right? Or just more broadly, the left, right? You can say Liberals are center left, NDP are left. And the left, there did not seem to be an appetite for it. So the question I think that I've been asking myself a lot is how much of this was the NDP's fault and how much of this was just like the situation, right? The Donald Trump situation, the 10 years of Trudeau situation, this kind of swing of the pendulum back to the center right, because Carney is certainly a swing back towards the right, and both Carney and Poilievre absorbed over 80% of the votes in this election, if I'm not mistaken. So why did people not vote?
I think it was almost 90%. Pretty sure it's almost 90%.
I'd be curious to know what that number is exactly. I don't think it's 90.
84,
I know
sorry.
Bloc,
84.
Yeah, the Bloc and the NDP got 6.5 each-ish. Greens, and then there's independents and smaller parties.
Libertarians.
PPC is still a thing, although I think they've been wiped off the map.
Anyone who was voting for the PPC got absorbed when Poilievre took charge, because any of us who voted for the PPC saw the types of things that Poilievre was saying and shifted over back to the Conservative Party. At that point, Maxime Bernier was not providing anything that the Conservatives weren't also providing.
I agree with that, and I think at this point the PPC are not even worth discussing.
Agreed. Beyond what I just did.
But look, the NDP were I think victims of both their own failures, Jagmeet's flip-flopping between supply and confidence. We ripped it up. Okay, so you're going to bring the government down? No, we're not. What? Like, what are you? I don't think Jagmeet seemed to have lost energy, ideas. He'd been around long enough that he couldn't rebrand himself in the current context. We knew him too well. And I just think that he largely was not the leader that the moment required. I think he probably should have stepped down earlier, although, he'll argue supply and confidence was a worthy pursuit because of things like pharmacare, dental care. And, that's not a terrible argument. And, a lot of my friends, colleagues, people I know, having been in the NDP atmosphere before, I know a lot of them are kind of pointing to what they're calling a poisoned media landscape. Be curious to get your opinion on that, as somebody thinks a lot about media and how the kind of leftist media, progressive voices were not really featured, not really heard. You can kind of point to places like CBC, Globe and Mail, who were not featuring leftist voices. So was that part of it, or was there just not an appetite? Jagmeet was not the guy to meet Trump, right?
No.
Jagmeet was not the guy you wanted in the room with Trump. So I think that on the surface, that's probably the simplest explanation. But I think that when you look at Trump winning himself, people being frustrated with the Democrats, what is it about the left that is failing to appeal to people right now? Is there something we can learn from Bernie Sanders in the States doing his Fight the Oligarchy tour, which seems to be pretty interesting and is his argument for how the Democratic Party should rebrand? What's your take on all that?
Okay, so I agree with at least a large chunk of that first part where you were talking about failing to meet the moment, and also the flip-flopping and everything. It definitely hurt them that they weren't, as I said, they weren't a party. They were just additional liberal seats. They just didn't call themselves that. And I think that hurt them. Another thing that I think definitely hurt them was enough of the left was willing to, I know you say that liberals are center-left, but really, even on most political compasses these days, the liberals are fairly, left. Not super left, but still fairly left. And a lot of the people who vote NDP likely voted in a strategic fashion just to prevent the Conservatives from getting those seats. If you take enough people who would have voted NDP in certain ridings and vote Liberal, it would steal that seat from the Conservative that may have won.
Strategic voting, baby.
It works. My mother voted for Justin Trudeau in 2015, despite my entire life her voting NDP. She wanted Stephen Harper gone, so she voted in the way that she thought would be best for that. Ended up not needing it, because it was kind of a landslide, but anyway, that doesn't matter.
Can I just say, it was so interesting. This was the first election that I really appreciated how the Maritimes, which the results of which come in like first 2 hours before the rest of the country, it gives you a pretty accurate picture of what's going to happen, right? What happened this time around was the Conservatives actually picked up a few seats. The Liberals held a majority of their seats. Mm-hmm. And so what it suggested was, okay, the Conservatives are creeping up a little bit, but not enough to overtake the Liberals. Yes. And that's what happened across the country, right? So it's kind of like, I'm going to pay more attention to the Maritimes next time around.
The Maritimes is a very centrist place. I'm going to get to that, but I want to continue talking about the NDP. One of the things that I think really hurt the NDP that you didn't bring up, but you mentioned something earlier, was that the Conservatives are doing really well with young men. And a lot of NDP voters were young men at one point. I was an NDP voter. First time I ever voted. I voted.
You were a young man at one point, but no longer.
Look at this gross beard. I'm clearly not a young man. I have a wife and son.
That's right.
I own a home. Right. On surveys, I don't get to pick the lowest age group anymore. I'm 30 plus. So, right. Yeah, so at one point I was the NDP, and they lost me. And I think the fact that the Conservatives in many ways have picked up those young men definitely hurt the NDP, because, like you said, the NDP lost in many areas, and the Liberals gained, and the Conservatives gained. And I don't think that's a surprise. The strategic voters that were NDP voted Liberal, and the swing right voters that were NDP voted for the Conservatives. Both of those things destroyed the NDP. You're right, Jagmeet was not the man for the situation. I think if he would have stepped down after the last election or in between them, and they had someone who had some vigor to them, they probably would have done better. Someone with some slightly different views.
The Liberals got to pick their candidate after Trump. Right? Yes. The NDP would not have gotten to pick their leader after Trump. So I think that was a pretty huge advantage, was like, okay, who do we want based on the fact that,
it's almost cheating in a way.
Almost cheating, but not.
It kind of is. It's not, but it kind of is. Anyway, one of the things I'm kind of sad on, and you're going to disagree with me on this, because you're gonna think that it would just be some generic racist thing. I would have loved to see what kind of nicknames that Donald Trump would come up for Jagmeet, because I don't think they would be just generic, things like raghead, which are awful to be, I think they would have been more interesting than that, because his nicknames are generally more dynamic and interesting than just the ones that you would come up as a slur. I think it would have been fun to see. You'll probably disagree with me on that.
Yeah, it's a hypothetical that'll never...
no, you'll never see the light of day. But I would have liked to see it.
Thing was on Trump's radar.
Yeah, he was basically a nobody to him. But yes.
Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was a Jagmeet Singh fan.
That doesn't surprise me. Anyway, I do want... Well, we can talk about that movement. Actually, let's talk about that movement and then get back to the Maritimes. Yes, I do think that the NDP could learn something from the Bernie Sanders and AOC Fight the Oligarchy movement. One of the things that drove me away from the NDP was a lot of the identity politics, the often anti-male sentiment, often not necessarily anti-white sentiment, although you could definitely see some of that in there, but far too pro-diversity in ways that men mainly white men felt like they were being denigrated for. It wasn't always just pro these groups, but it was often, these groups are better, or these groups are more important to us, whether or not that's true. That's how many people saw it, and I felt that in some ways. And when you see things like AOC taking out her pronouns from her bio, and Bernie Sanders no longer speaking in the ways that he did in 2020 about the border, he went back to, in 2016, Bernie was pro closing the border. In 2020, he was pro open border. And a lot of that was a reaction to Trump, and I think turning back to his old school lefty economic issues is a much better way to bring people like me back to the fold, back to the left. And I think if the NDP were to do that, they would benefit. But at the same time, a lot of the people who do vote NDP are pro those other ideas that push me away. And so if the NDP were to drop those, they would feel slighted by that. So they put themselves in a difficult situation, one that I don't know how they get out of. Luckily, I'm not a political strategist. I just talk shit about it on the internet.
Yeah, not my problem. Yeah, I think the NDP tried to just do a bit of like a cookie cutter Bernie Sanders thing, and they said, something to the simple effect of, CEOs, greedy CEOs, and that's true. We actually have a huge corporate welfare bums problem in this country as well. Although the power of money in politics is much more limited here than it is in the States, right? We have campaign finance rules in a way the States basically don't.
They have some, but there's so many loopholes that it makes it basically worthless.
Yeah, Jagmeet's thing was, the reason that we have rising grocery prices is because Galen Weston is a greedy CEO who has just jacked up prices at Loblaws. Is it Loblaws that he owns?
I don't know. We don't have Loblaws in New Brunswick.
You have Sobeys.
That's right. Superior alternative.
That's right. But that's it. That is true. It's actually not inaccurate. It's not the full picture, not even close.
I'm glad that you, as an NDP person, acknowledge that, because I think that's important. I think that's important.
It was basic economic literacy that I think Jagmeet failed to communicate. You need to have an economic message always. That's like something that I've learned, is that if you are a leader of a political party, you're running for president, prime minister, whatever, your message better be economic. Mm-hmm. If it ain't, you ain't going nowhere. And I think that the problem that Jagmeet had is that, yes, he was talking economics, but he did not display a clear understanding of basic economic principles. And voters are not stupid, right? We're not stupid and just going to say, oh yeah, you're right. It's exclusively greedy CEOs who are jacking up their prices. That's the only reason things are so expensive, right? It's the greedy landlords. Actually, there's more to it than that, right? Yeah. And you need to treat us as intelligent individuals, as opposed to kind of just pitching us this blank argument. Yeah. It totally failed, right? It would have they would have gotten absolutely wiped if they didn't have those 7 superstar MPs who held their seats.
NDP MP.
Who were all extremely well respected in their communities, and there were a ton of other really great NDP candidates. Let me just say, I know a lot of them. A lot of them were fantastic people, and I think that they were really hurt by Jagmeet and his failure to convey a clear understanding of what was going on. Mm-hmm. So I think a revamp, a kind of a clear distinction from the Liberal Party, which has shifted to the center, and so now to be a true leftist party, it's going to take time for sure. I think it's not as though the NDP could have a new leader and be popular in the polls tomorrow, but I think that there is an opportunity. It's just that your economic message, which needs to be central to your party, your identity, but it needs to be one that makes sense, right?
Yeah, and it can't be surface deep. There has to be some depth to it. People aren't stupid.
That's right. you need to talk to people like they're intelligent. And it kind of felt to me as though Jagmeet, I couldn't listen to him talk, to be honest, because I was like, you're just repeating the same platitudes that I've heard you say 1,000 times, and I'm too smart to buy your bullshit. Sorry, this is me being a little bit frustrated with him.
I understand. You're an NDP voter, so
treat voters with respect. And I think a lot of the great candidates who would have won under different circumstances, and I'm not just blaming Jagmeet, I'm blaming Trump, I'm blaming just inflation, other outside forces that are out of our control. But Jagmeet did not respect the intelligence of the Canadian electorate, and he got smoked for it. So, best of luck to him. But you were not the leader that the party needed.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to disagree with that on. I hope, as someone who used to vote for the NDP, I hope they pick someone who is intelligent, passionate, hardworking, and, as I said, has vigor. I guess that falls under passionate, but you could have a passionate person who doesn't have joie de vivre and life about them.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders is like 85. He doesn't exactly have the kind of oomph that is necessary to lead a party. So I think it does need to be someone, 45 years old, roughly, someone who still has energy, and really cares about the working people, but is smart enough to treat us with the respect that we deserve.
The Conservative Party have, over time, leached so many NDP voters,
yes,
right?
That's what I
Working class, union voters, right? Like, they've all switched. I know. They've all switched to the Conservatives. You have switched to the Conservatives.
Well, I didn't vote Conservative. I did not vote for the Conservatives.
You didn't?
No. If you go back and listen to these podcasts, I explicitly say, 1, who I'm voting for, and 2, that I will not vote for the Conservatives or the Liberals until a third party reaches leadership.
Right. Okay, what? Did I black out at one point?
Yeah, you probably just weren't listening to me. I ramble. I go on for too long. All of a sudden, I start repeating myself.
Who did you vote for, Kieran? Tell me.
I voted for the Libertarian Party candidate. Keith Taze was his name.
Right.
I apologize,
now
Keith.
that you say that.
Now your name's going to be blasted on the internet to all of our massive amounts of viewers.
Yeah, exactly. But,
no, but you're right. You're right. The NDP lost a bunch of people to the Conservatives because a lot of us are fairly culturally conservative in, like, we wanted our immigration numbers down because if you don't have a proper integration policy for your immigration policy, then you end up with ghettos and you end up with culture shock, and that doesn't bode well for a country. You look at what's going on in Europe. There's a lot of culture shock, a lot of things that have happened because they haven't had a proper integration policy for their immigration policy, and that really has affected them. And Canada, culturally conservative Canadians did not want that, even if they might be Labour-style voters in, like, union politics. They voted Conservative, or Conservative-like.
I'd like to kind of move to our last point, the point that we've been, saying we're going to discuss and haven't totally gotten into it, which is, where do we go from here, right? Carney is...
Can we jump back to just a few minutes on talking about the Maritimes, because you brought that up. The Maritimes is...
Okay, yeah, go for it.
The Maritimes is a weather vane for the rest of Canada. First of all, we were the first Canadians. Second of all, the electorate in...
Wait, the first Canadian?
Yeah, we were the first Canadians. The people who landed in North America first, like, if you look at it, we came east and then moved west. So the first Canadians, not the indigenous peoples.
Well, it wasn't called Canada. I think the better argument is you made up half the provinces of Confederation.
Okay, maybe at the time, but now we're a fraction of the population. But either way, Canada is...
Now nobody gives a fuck.
The Maritimes is a very centrist area. You have your liberal peoples, you have your conservative peoples. Weirdly, because it's an island, Prince Edward Island is a very green heavy place, but New
Very
Brunswick,
green. And,
yeah, very green, because they don't want their island to be sunk into the ocean. So if like you said, if you watch those first 3-4 hours of election coverage, you can pretty much guess how it's going to go just based off of how the Maritimes go. You could have some upsets if weird things happen, but usually that's how it's going to go. A lot of conservative and a lot of liberal seats are very solid, maybe flip back and forth, but you rarely see an NDP pop up in New Brunswick, except maybe on provincial level, but provincial politics are always different. One of the things that I actually think is really interesting is that the bastion of left politics in Canada is British Columbia, and then the most adjacent province to it is also the bastion of conservative politics in Canada.
Interesting. Yeah.
So, like, the most left-wing people are directly next to the most right-wing people in the country.
Yeah. Yeah. The most beautiful nature beside the deepest oil wells.
Hey, man, all of Canada benefits from those oil wells. The wealth transfer payments from those oil wells benefit every province except Alberta itself. Quebec receives shit tons of money from those oil wells.
Yeah. I don't want to talk about that.
That's why this rising tide of Alberta separatist, which is a new thing, has come about.
It's not new.
It's it hasn't had the momentum. It now has more momentum than Quebec separatism has right now.
Do you know what the polling is?
No, not off the top of my head, but based off of the sentiment of hearing people talk online and everything. Granted, online is different from real life, but it's a sentiment that is much more prominent now than I've ever heard, whereas Quebec separatism is on the back burner. They have bigger priorities right now.
Quebec separatism is at 28% right now. 28% of Quebecers support.
It's like a quarter of the people. That's not that great.
Yeah, so it's been higher in the past. It's relatively muted, but it
was at 49% in the past once.
49.7 or some shit.
Yeah. Anyway, let's move on. We'll get to our final portion of this discussion because we're almost an hour in, and we like to try and keep it, less than an hour and a half. So, take it away.
Take it away.
You're more eloquent than I am, so you're gonna be the one to do this, and then I'll respond.
Okay. Carney has 170 seats. He met with Trump last week. He swore his cabinet in this week. Pretty interesting, eh? He started the week 2 weeks ago with an election victory. Week later, went to meet with Trump. Week later, swore in his cabinet. So he's had a pretty big couple weeks. Look, I think Carney's on the right foot, is what I would say. His meeting with Trump, which is the cornerstone of his ministership, his relationship with Trump, his ability to deal with Trump, it went well. I think that if you watched it, and I watched the whole thing start to finish, he was able to convey to Trump, Canada's not for sale, it will never be for sale. And Trump didn't really fight him. He said never say never, but I think that's just a way for him to not back down. But it kind of seems as though he is backing down right now. That with all this kind of turmoil at home, there's all this stuff with China right now,
and the Middle East.
The wind that was in the sails of the whole 51st state thing has kind of died down, and I think that a part of that is that we have a new, stronger prime minister than Trudeau was at the time, right? He was a very weak prime minister, and I think Trump smelled that. But now Carney has a mandate, right? Carney has a strong mandate. He's got 170, 2 away from a majority. He's sworn his cabinet, which looks pretty different from Trudeau's. I don't know all of them super well, but I know that he made enough changes that you can't say this is the same cabinet that Trudeau ran with. So you know what? It feels to me as though he hasn't made any mistakes yet. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, so as much as I'm not a fan of a lot of the ideas that he wrote about in his book. I have to agree with most of what you said there. He has done fairly well in his meeting with Trump. As I said, he played him in the ways. He flattered him when he needed to be flattered, but pushed back when he needed to push back. One of the things that I think really helps him is Trump had zero respect for Justin Trudeau. Zero respect for the man. As much as Trump denigrates the higher ed universities like Harvard and Columbia and Yale, he loves people who have those kinds of qualifications. And so, being a highly educated person, as Mark Carney is, he loves that about him. And he just won an election, a fairly, not a resounding win, but it was a win, and it was practically the best kind of win he could have gotten. So he definitely sees that he's a stronger man than Trudeau was, because Trudeau was, their party was going to be destroyed until he resigned. And you're right about the winds of the 51st state, although, you probably think it was a hurricane. I think it was a gust. I don't think that was ever a real serious thing. More so, I think he was ribbing us. But, as you said,
I was never flipping out about it. I was never I had people in my orbit who were freaking out. I was nervous, but it did feel largely like bluster.
Yeah.
And I think now that we have Carney in it feels different. Mm-hmm. I think if Trudeau had, for example, had 2 more years and had the ability to stick around, maybe we'd be in a different position. I'm not worried anymore.
Part of the reason I think that is like you said, there's so much going on down in the States, not just in the States, but with regards to their
globally, yeah.
Their federal international dealings. There's potentially a peace deal in the Middle East. They're trying to work out a deal in the Ukraine. There's all the negotiations going on with China. So I think that Trump doesn't have the mental capacity, not that he's mentally challenged or anything, but that's too much effort to try and push back against the force that Mark Carney will push back with. Whereas if Trudeau had been there, he probably would have done an analysis that said, I require less, it doesn't take as much force to be able to push him in the ways that he would like. So he might have continued with that banter a little longer if Trudeau had stayed on, even with all the stuff going on internationally that he's dealing with, and domestically, because all of the tariffs that they've put on have caused some turmoil nationally that he's recovering from, or trying to recover from.
Yeah.
Calling it a win by backing off his own policies and then saying, look, it worked, our economy's recovering. Overall, I think Carney's first few weeks have been successful. As I said, I'm not a fan of the things that he's written about, but I don't have enough to complain about right now with what he's done. I don't know every single person in his cabinet, so I can't comment on the types of ideas that they're going to be pushing for. I just hope that from here on out we see better things from them than we did Justin Trudeau's party, because there's a reason that I call them the illiberal party of Canada, and I hope to be able to refer to them as the liberal party of Canada. They need to go back to their roots of being liberals, not illiberal people, not authoritarians. So I have high hopes because they've changed enough from what I've seen that I am going to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah. I would sometimes call them the neoliberal party.
Yeah, that's another good one.
Ultra-capitalist party that, was absolutely unwilling to stand up to corporate interests. I think that's still true. That's probably my biggest gripe with this party, is that they are never willing to stand up to particularly oil and gas, who I feel is, a big problem. I know you disagree with that.
I think the government not being able to stand up to industries is a problem. I don't think oil and gas is specifically a giant problem. Mainly because I think it's important to have oil and gas because people rely on fuel for travel, heating, power. So I don't think it's as
yeah.
as big of a problem
We're
as
in
you
a
do.
clean energy revolution now, and that's changing. And climate change is still a thing. Hate to remind everyone about that. Still here.
No one needs to be reminded. Everyone knows.
Everyone needs to be reminded. Everyone needs to be reminded. Everyone seems to have forgotten about it, and it's extremely frustrating to me.
Politically, it is a thing that has fallen off of the list of important things.
It's off the radar.
I'm.
How is that possible?
Did they talk about it at all during the leadership debates? I don't even think so. Maybe like 2 minutes.
They talked about it in the context of energy. They did talk about energy, but as far as emissions, as far as rising temperatures, they didn't really talk about it.
Yeah.
Which was very disappointing to me. Anyway, but I think that's probably my biggest problem with the Liberal Party is that they tweak here and there, but they are not a bold party. But like you, I'm also willing to see where this goes with Carney. I made up my mind about Trudeau. I feel as though I like some of the things that he did, but also was very disappointed with some of the things that he did. I don't think he will go down as a great prime minister by any stretch of the imagination. But you know what? I'm happy that Carney won. I much prefer him over Polyev, and I am also willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and wish him luck, right? Because, like it or not, you are the leader of my country. You are my prime minister. I accept you as my prime minister, and I hope that you will stand up for us and do well by us in these next years, without knowing how many that will be.
Amen to that. Thanks for stopping by.
Cheers, everybody.